Imagine being a queen, but your own husband refuses to let you enter your coronation. Imagine arriving at the doors of Westminster Abbey, expecting to be crowned beside the man who is now King of Britain, only to have those doors slammed shut in your face. It happened to Queen Caroline of Brunswick, the wife of King George IV. The story begins in 1795. George was not yet king. He was the Prince of Wales, and he had a serious problem. He was drowning in debt. George was famous for his extravagant lifestyle. He spent enormous amounts of money on clothes, parties, luxury, and entertainment. His father, King George III, was furious. But George had a solution. His father offered to clear his enormous debts, but only if George agreed to marry. The bride was Caroline of Brunswick, a German princess and George's cousin. George accepted. Not because he was in love. Not because he admired Caroline. He agreed because he wanted his debts paid. Caroline traveled to Britain for the marriage, probably expecting that she was about to begin her life as a future queen. Instead, her first meeting with George was a disaster. According to accounts of the encounter, George was deeply unimpressed by her. And Caroline wasn't exactly captivated by him either. She found him unattractive, overweight, and rude. There was no romantic spark. There wasn't even much politeness. Yet they went ahead with the wedding. And on April 8, 1795, George and Caroline were married. It was supposed to be the beginning of a royal dynasty. Their wedding night was reportedly miserable. The couple could barely stand each other. But despite their hatred, they managed to fulfill their royal obligation. And just 9 months later, Caroline gave birth to a daughter. Princess Charlotte. For a brief moment, it seemed like the marriage had achieved exactly what George's father wanted. There was an heir. But George wanted nothing more. Only days after Charlotte's birth, George made it clear that he wanted Caroline out of his life. The couple separated permanently. George returned to the women he actually preferred. Caroline was left largely on her own. She established a separate household and became known for hosting lively gatherings. She also took an interest in children and adopted several orphans. But there was one person she desperately wanted to remain close to. Her daughter, Charlotte. And this was where the conflict became even more painful. George increasingly restricted Caroline's access to Charlotte. And as Caroline's popularity grew, George became increasingly suspicious of her. Then came the secret investigation that would change everything. George suspected that Caroline had been unfaithful. Rumors began circulating that she had even given birth to a child. So the king secretly ordered an investigation. It became known as the Delicate Investigation. Investigators questioned servants and examined Caroline's private life. They searched for evidence that she had committed but there was a major problem. They couldn't prove that Caroline had given birth to a secret child. However, the investigation did produce damaging allegations about her behavior. And George wasn't finished. Caroline eventually left Britain and began traveling throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. During these travels, she openly associated with an Italian man named Bartolomeo Pergami. But to George, it was perfect ammunition. Now he had the scandal he had been looking for. Then, in 1820, everything changed. King George III died. George became King George IV. And Caroline was suddenly no longer just the estranged wife of the Prince of Wales. She was technically Queen of Britain. There was just one problem. George didn't want her anywhere near his kingdom. George refused to recognize Caroline as queen. He reportedly tried to prevent her name from being included in church prayers. He even threatened to stop her from returning to Britain. But Caroline wasn't going to disappear quietly. She sailed back to England. And something extraordinary happened. The British public rallied around her. Why? Because they already had a complicated relationship with George. He was known for enormous spending and extravagant living. And now the king was trying to destroy the reputation of his own wife. To many ordinary people, Caroline became a symbol. The abandoned wife. The woman fighting against a powerful husband. And George suddenly had a public relations disaster on his hands. But he had one weapon left. The government. George's supporters pushed for the government to introduce the Bill of Pains and Penalties. Its purpose was extraordinary. It would strip Caroline of her status as queen and effectively allow George to end their marriage on the grounds of her alleged. The case went before the House of Lords. And Britain became obsessed. Newspapers covered every detail. Crowds gathered. Witnesses were called. Stories about Caroline's life abroad were presented as evidence of her alleged affair with Pergamy. It looked like the king had finally found a way to destroy his wife. But then Caroline's lawyers fought back. And they did something extremely dangerous. They turned attention toward George himself. His own history of infidelity became part of the public conversation. Suddenly, this wasn't simply a trial about whether Caroline had behaved improperly. It was becoming a trial about the morality of the king. And the British public was watching. The government began to realize that pushing the case too far could create enormous unrest. The bill passed its second reading, but its support weakened dramatically. Eventually, the government abandoned the measure. Caroline had survived. She hadn't been stripped of her position. She hadn't been legally defeated. But George still had one final opportunity to humiliate, and it came at his coronation. July 1821. George IV was about to be crowned at Westminster Abbey. And Caroline believed she had every right to be there. After all, she was the queen. So she arrived. She demanded entry. But George had prepared for this moment. Guards were waiting. Caroline was refused entry at multiple points. She tried several entrances. But the doors remained closed. Imagine the scene. The woman who had spent years fighting to preserve her position as queen was standing outside the very building where her husband was being crowned king. Inside, the ceremony continued. Outside, Caroline was turned away. Eventually, she left. She had lost the battle for the coronation. But there was something George could never completely control. The sympathy of the public. The crowd's reaction to Caroline remained far more sympathetic than the king would have wanted. And then, just days later, tragedy struck. Caroline became seriously ill. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. Despite attempts to treat her, she died on August 7, 1821. She was only 53 years old. But even in death, the conflict wasn't over. George wanted Caroline's funeral and burial handled in a way that would minimize public unrest. Her coffin was eventually transported out of London for burial in Brunswick, her homeland. The woman who had arrived in Britain as a future princess had spent the final years of her life fighting the king himself. And in the end, she died without ever receiving the coronation she believed she deserved. There is a strange irony in the story of George IV and Caroline. George had almost everything. He had wealth. He had power. He had the crown. He had the government behind him. And yet, when he tried to destroy Caroline's reputation, he couldn't completely control what the public thought of her. The king wanted history to remember Caroline as a scandalous, embarrassing wife. But history remembered something more complicated. It remembered a deeply unhappy marriage. A husband who wanted freedom from his wife. A wife who refused to quietly surrender her rights. A royal scandal that captivated an entire nation. The king won the ceremony. Caroline won the public. And centuries later, we're still talking about her.